2, 3, 4, testing 1, 2, 3, 4, testing 1, 2, 3, 4, testing, testing. Oh, that explains.
Good evening. My name is Massie Tajideen, and I'm a member of the Institute of Politics Student Advisory Committee, and I would like to welcome you all for coming down here this evening to discuss the politics of cults. As I'm sure you all know, about 3 weeks ago, we were all captivated by a certain incident that took place in San Diego, and this certainly spurred a great deal of interest among students here at Harvard and everywhere in the world. And we were interested primarily in discussing the politics of cults in America and the future of cults in America and a little bit about the past of cults in America. Today we've gathered here to gain a better understanding about cults, not about any particular cults, not about any particular organizations affiliated with cults, but about the phenomenon of cults in general. We have chosen each of our speakers today, who our moderator, the director of the Institute of Politics, Phil Sharp, will introduce, based on their expertise in dealing with cults or groups that are high demand in such a fashion, which they'll discuss. I hope you all enjoy it, and I encourage all the undergraduates to ask questions after we open to it. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Mr. Phil Sharp.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Massie Tajideen and the Projects Committee of the SAC, or Student Advisory Committee, to the Institute of Politics, who did the work, who originated the idea and did the work of bringing together the panel that we have. You're somewhat at a disadvantage this evening in terms of your moderator, because this is not a topic on which I profess any particular knowledge, wisdom, or experience with, but I'll do my best to try to moderate some folks that the students have brought together who have had experience and information and knowledge about the topic. First off, we're delighted to hear from, the way we'll proceed is each of our speakers will speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll have somewhat of an interchange among them, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience from our 2 microphones at that point. I'm very pleased to introduce as our first speaker this evening, Peter Klebnikoff. He's an investigative reporter who has been a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and his work has appeared in most of our leading journalist organs in this country. He has a book underway now called The Cult Next Door, and most recently when the issue arose in national media, he was featured his work in Newsweek magazine. He is also a consultant with respect to doomsday cults for NBC. And indeed, I think part of his main focus is on those cults which are known as doomsday cults. Peter. Thank you.
Good evening. First of all, I wanted to thank the Institute of Politics for holding such an interesting and timely debate tonight. I think it's altogether fitting that we are doing this at the Institute of Politics because the whole subject of cults is one of the most controversial subjects in America today that I've encountered in my 20 years as an investigative reporter. Thanks. Yeah, I'm taxing your electronics here, I think. And I wanted to speak briefly about the issue of doomsday cults in America. This is a subject which I became involved in about 2 years ago. I was interested in how America is processing the millennium and the year 2000, And I'd been stationed in Russia, in the former Soviet Union, for many years. And I got involved in the subject when I was running a newspaper there, and I was approached by a cult member who tried to indoctrinate me and my staff members. And he wouldn't leave the room. And I got very nervous and finally had to call the police. The police in Russia are more corrupt and probably more cult-like than cult members. But we finally did throw him out, and 2 months later the group tried to commit suicide, mass suicide, and 450 people were stopped at the brink of suicide. So I said to myself, this is an amazing phenomenon that people are so motivated and mobilized by the millennium that they're ready to do something like this. And I started doing internet searches and studying all sorts of interesting forum about the subject, and decided what better way to come back to America than to see all the strangest groups that I can find in America. So I went and bought a used car early last summer and embarked on what I call a millennial road trip, going around various states trying to find groups that are the most the most heartfelt, the most impassioned believers in the millennium and in the fact that the world is going to end very soon. And I found something very interesting. I found that whereas cults have been around since the dawn of humanity, probably, the first cult probably appeared when there was a dissenter from the established religion, or the established orthodoxy. And cults come and go, and it's always been a somewhat limited phenomenon, except in the year 1000, when hundreds of thousands of people gathered in the Vatican, and they had ashes on their head and sackcloth put on them, and they heard the Pope speak, and the clock struck midnight, and a lot of people died of fear because they were convinced the world was ending. And when the world didn't end, they sort of looked at their neighbors and hugged each other and went back to work the next day. But today we're finding, and what I found, visiting cults and actually infiltrating and living with them, pretending to be a member of their cults, was that there are certain very interesting mutations that have occurred in the past few years. And I think that today there are some very, very senior experts here who will shed further light on this. But some of the things that I found, and most of the cults that I actually hit, were in the West and the Midwest. There's a cult which is quite active in Boston here. They have a house not too far from here. And I can't tell you the address of it because these people are pretty paranoid already. But the title of the book that I'm writing is The Cult Next Door, because indeed some of these cults have perfected a technique through the use of modern technology of getting new members without ever really leaving their houses. And I think we saw that in the Heaven's Gate group as well. And the role of technology has completely transformed the whole business of cults. No longer does a prophet have to climb up on a tree and shout into the wind, the world is ending. Now he gets on the internet. Now he gets on public access TV stations and gets his word out. And we're finding that a lot more people are entering cults because of high technology, and there's very little monitoring going on. And many of the people that I lived with indeed had been recruited through high technology. So another thing that, perhaps the most interesting thing to me that I saw, was that there's an amazing cross-fertilization between cults, organizations who a couple of years ago only would have not been caught dead in the same town together. They would have been mortal enemies. And a good example of this is the Church Universal and Triumphant right by Yellowstone Park in Montana. I spent a week there under the guise of a Russian spiritual writer, and they thought I was another Tolstoy or something, and invited me in, and I didn't tell them much more than that. But this group is basically a New Age cult. There's a lady who runs it, Elizabeth Clare Prophet, and they believe that the world is ending anytime soon. They've built a series of bunkers in the mountains right next to Yellowstone, and you can buy a bunker for $10,000. If you want plumbing in it, it's $12,000, and it's all very well organized. And this group is basically a New Age group that has slowly joined with the militias that are very prevalent in Montana and in Wyoming. And somehow they've made common cause, and they've managed to take the best from, or what's the most useful from each group, and strengthen themselves. This cross-fertilization exists, I think, throughout most of the cults that we see appearing today. And that's what makes them really different, I think, from previous cults, because there's so much more communication going on. Another good example is the whole UFO phenomenon, which is one of the most interesting and understudied areas on the American social scene, I believe. I think in 20, 30 years, we're going to be amazed by the whole sort of growth of the UFO phenomenon. And UFO conventions are held throughout the Western states, pretty much throughout the year. And in the past year or so, we've seen an entire sort of a faction of speakers and of exhibitors at these UFO conventions, which are generally filled with peace-loving people who eat organic food and are waiting to be levitated off, which is sort of a Christian notion of ecstasy. And all of a sudden, we see these factions appearing, which are basically militia groups, who are instructing people on how to survive doomsday. And they're teaching them survival skills. They're teaching them how to defend themselves. And to me, it was shocking, but not at all surprising, that the Church Universal and Triumphant in Montana was caught with $150,000 of semi-automatic weapons. And nobody seemed to ask why a church needed these semi-automatic weapons, and they very kindly agreed to give up the weapons in order to keep their tax-exempt status as a church. But the government, in its wisdom, never asked that question. So one of the fascinating things is that these conventions are beginning to resemble sort of like Hell Week at a fraternity, and there's people competing in talk of doom. And one of the points that I wanted to make, perhaps we can return to it later, is that no cults today, and people estimate that there are between 3,000 and 5,000 cults, serious cults in America today. And I'm convinced that no cult would exist if it were not supported by what I call a millennial ecosystem, where there's a bunch of like-minded people who make these people feel at home. Often you can travel to various cities in America, where New Age cities, where there's a lot more tolerance and temperance, and these are wonderful virtues. That's what made America great. But these people are so non-judgmental that they think nothing of having Marshall Applewhite as a neighbor. And during my trip, I would be listening to AM radio, and in the West, there's amazing stations that are going on now, and the conversations and arguments about when exactly the world is going to end. There's signs up all over the highways, and these cults feel that they're more at home in these areas. One of the things that has happened, I think, is that our society bears some share of responsibility here in the proliferation of these doomsday cults. I think there's sort of a commercialization of fear going on right now in our society, and a lot of people are millennial making money off of fear, off of the millennial trauma that society, trauma is sort of a harsh word, or millennial unease, I'd say, that American society is feeling right now. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because these cults see that people are getting more worried about them and wondering about the stock market, wondering about what's happened, what the Palestinians are doing. And one thing that you find with a doomsday cult, or I think any cult, is that they don't believe in any coincidences at all. Everything is an omen, and there's up to like 15 million people who take every political fact and analyze it according to the Book of Revelations in America today. And so there's a very fertile soil today in America for these groups to get their members from. And that's one main reason why cults are growing so fast today in America. Another thing that seems to unite all these cults and sort of helps the cross-fertilization is the fact that they distrust the federal government. which I think is common to most people in America these days. But this is one thing that if you study Marshall Applewhite's teachings and the Heaven's Gate teachings, he feared that the Evo UFOs, the Evo extraterrestrials, were in collusion with the federal government and were obtaining high technology weapons from the government in exchange, and they were giving the government human DNA so that the Evo extraterrestrials could replenish their stock. And this is something which dovetails completely with militia thinking, of course, that there's a one world government. And you find UFO groups who believe that the United Nations is an evil force controlled by evil extraterrestrials. So this is something which is, as I say, is quite new. And I think in closing my initial remarks, I'd say that from my experience of living with these cults, from seeing their neighbors, how their neighbors react to them, I think we as a society are not prepared for the proliferation of cults and the eventuality that another Heaven's Gate will occur. We haven't really dealt with it, and it is one of the most complex subjects. Nobody really even agrees what exactly is a cult, and it's something that society is going to have to deal with very seriously in the coming years ahead, because some of the groups I visited are on the brink, I would consider, and if anybody's interested, I'd be happy to expound on what I saw there. So thank you very much for your attention.
Now pleased to introduce Cynthia Kisser. Cynthia Kisser has done extensive speaking and writing about cults. She has focused on deprogramming in particular. She was the executive director of the Cult Awareness Network from 1987, I believe, until 1996. The Cult Network was challenged in court on many occasions and did lose some major lawsuits for their tactics on deprogramming. And she's, I believe, going to focus on deprogramming here at this point. Cynthia Kisser.
Actually, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I wasn't planning to. I was asked to speak on the politics of cults as a broad statement, but I'll answer questions on other topics later. There was only one lawsuit that the Cult Awareness Network ever actually lost in a final judgment, but just for anybody who is keeping a tally sheet out there of the 51 lawsuits that we were involved in. The politics of cults. First, I want to say that these opinions are my opinions. They don't represent any other organizations. If I mention a group by name as an example of a point, it doesn't necessarily mean that I think it's a cult or that you should think it's a cult, but that it has been in the news or has been controversial in terms of allegations that it may be cultic. When I think of cults in politics, I think of certain institutions in America that are affected by cults. So I'm going to just quickly touch on some of those institutions and how they, I feel, have been affected by this whole cult topic. First of all, cults and the media. Scientology sues Time magazine for its May 1991 cover story, Scientology, the Cult of Greed. Even though Scientology loses the suit, it costs Time an estimated $7 million to defend itself. And it sends a chilling message to other media that the cost of writing the truth may be too high. Academia. Religious scholar J. Gordon Melton, with his Religious Studies Center at the University of Santa Barbara, accepts money from Aum Shinrikyo to travel to Japan and lodge a protest that Aum is being unfairly characterized as a terrorist group because it's a non-traditional new religion. As you may remember, in March of '95, Aum members killed 11 people and injured over 5,000 others in a sarin nerve gas attack in the subways of Tokyo. Aum members have testified to killing a lawyer who opposed the group, as well as his wife and baby, and have admitted to committing other murders and criminal acts at the command of Oshihara, the leader. Academicians in America are for hire by unsavory groups. Cults and business. The consulting firm of Gregory May and Associates pled guilty in 1995 to felony mail fraud following an investigation after complaints by FAA senior management and executives of being verbally humiliated and degraded during cult-like training sessions. 2,000 people took the on-the-job training over 9 years. The business field is a lucrative source of income and recruits for cults. Religion. In the mid-'80s, major denominations in this country signed onto an amicus brief to try and prevent 2 former members of the Unification Church of Sun Myung Moon from having the right to sue the church for unethical and fraudulent practices. The U.S. Supreme Court later upheld the California Supreme Court's decision that they did, in fact, have the right to proceed with the litigation. These organizations, denominations, and religious organizations, I feel, are so uneducated on the differences between destructive cults versus ethically run denominations that they are afraid that they might be called a cult. Government. Church Universal and Triumphant uses tax-exempt funds to illegally purchase firearms and engage in profit-making entities that compete with legitimate businesses. Groups take advantage of privileges the government extends to religious organizations. Litigation is another tactic, suing your critics, preferably out of existence. Courts. A bankruptcy judge in the federal court for the Northern District of Illinois permits the sale of the trade name and transfer of goodwill as quote-unquote property in a bankruptcy proceeding in which the nonprofit Cult Awareness Network, of which I was the executive director, they had used the trade name, and in violation of the Lanham Act, the court permitted the sale to a group of individuals with ties to the Church of Scientology who now operate under that name with the old nonprofit's phone number in a manner totally inconsistent and totally antithetical to how the old non-for-profit operated, causing confusion and problems for media, families, even Harvard University when they were trying to figure out how to reach me. Cults are willing to pour enough money into the legal system to use it to destroy their critics. The general public. The general public sees millions of tax dollars paid for everything from armed confrontations to criminal trials to the cost of protecting children who have been seized in abuse situations where there's been some type of physical or other exploitation. Families. 39 families now are going about the business of burying their loved ones who committed suicide as loyal followers of Applewhite of Heaven's Gate. Families see loved ones exploited psychologically, financially, sometimes sexually, on a fairly regular basis, and nothing can be done about it because it's perfectly legal. Individuals. In 1991, Elridge Broussard Jr., the leader of Ecclesia Athletic Association, and several of his followers are charged with slavery and violating the civil rights of more than 24 children following the murder of a 7-year-old in the group. This is the largest mass slavery trial in the history of the United States that occurred. Federal investigators said Broussard and other ecclesia leaders used systematic beatings and other types of physical force to compel children aged 3 to 18 to be an exhibition team that ran long distance and performed precision drills and other exercises to obtain money from corporations. Broussard dies of a heart attack before his trial, and eventually 7 members are convicted of a conspiracy to deny civil rights as part of a plea bargain. Individuals have their basic human rights violated every day in cults. Children get inadequate education, improper medical care, suffer physical abuse, sexual abuse, and these actions are legitimized under the popular slogan, well, we really can't do anything about it because one man's cult is another man's religion. And, you know, I would like to tell some little child when it's just about ready to die in its last gasp, well, we know you've been beaten to death, you know, but we really can't do anything for you because one man's cult is another man's religion. Our nation is robbed of bright, talented individuals and loses or spends billions of dollars repairing the damage caused by cults in this country. The politics of cults reveals that cults are shaping the politics of this country's major institutions. Not a month goes by, sometimes a week probably, that there is not a cult-related tragedy, crime, or legal case that comes to light somewhere. And while we cannot undo the damage that cults have caused to this country in the past, we can increase awareness of how and why cults flourish. And we can teach the next generation the right kind of questions to ask before they make a commitment for their future. We teach our young people how to avoid date rape, the dangers of AIDS, drugs, alcoholism. These days, we need to teach them how to avoid being recruited by a cult. No one's religious or political rights need to be violated in the process of such an educational process. No names of specific groups even need to be mentioned. Just as you teach a student not to go to an isolated spot with someone unknown to them to avoid a crime of opportunity concerning rape, So you can teach that student not to go away for a weekend retreat without knowing the background of that group, and you can teach them how to research, how to ask the right questions. If that kind of viewpoint that I'm putting forth is viewed as religious bigotry, as I have often been accused of holding, or anti-cult hysteria, then it's no wonder we have a cult problem that isn't going to go away soon.
Thank you very much. One of our panelists, Joseph Kelly, unfortunately became ill and could not be with us this evening. But our last panelist we're very pleased to have with us is Eugene B. Gallagher. He is a professor of religion at Connecticut College, the author of the book Why Waco. He got his PhD in the history of religions from the University of Chicago. Eugene Gallagher.
Thanks for the invitation here to the forum, and I think that we'll see education at work. I couldn't agree more with Ms. Kisser that it is very important to ask the right questions. I probably couldn't disagree with her more about what the right questions are, so at least you'll have another option to consider. I was given a slightly different topic, and it's vacillated in our correspondence. Originally, I was to talk about cult awareness, a difficult topic for various reasons. I wanted to say that we need to ask certain questions about cult awareness. Of what, for whom, and for what purposes? We've heard two presentations that respond to those. I want to raise some other questions about awareness of difference and how to respond to it, about awareness of dissent and what its limits should be, awareness of prejudice and what its effects can be, awareness of stereotypes and why they need to be questioned, awareness of the power of the state to enforce conformity and when that power can legitimately be used. Unlike our other two presenters, I find that the term cult has virtually no descriptive value whatsoever. It's much more a value judgment and a polemical attempt at social location. One of the keys to understanding that is I have never in my research found the word cult used in the first person. I belong to a cult. It is always used in the second or more often third person. You belong to a questionable religious group. He's in some wacko cult. So I think that there's a fundamental difference in terminology that reflects the questions that different people ask. I want to propose three things about so-called cults for consideration. They are: all cults have a history, a context, and an internal logic. I differ with the first presenter in saying that this is certainly not a new phenomenon, not limited to the second half of the 20th century at all. New religious movements or alternative religions appear through time and across cultures. Think only of the Yahweh alone movement in ancient Israel, the Jesus movement in first century Palestine, the worship of Dionysus in the Greco-Roman world, the rise of Buddhism in ancient India, and the rise of Islam in 6th century Arabia, before you even get close to the present. So a full understanding and a full set of questions demands a historical and comparative perspective. That long view shows us a rhythm in religious life of innovation and accommodation. The formation of sects and cults is an inevitable part of any religious economy. In some ways, trying to stop cults is like trying to stop the weather. Lots of people talk about it, but it's hard to do something about it. The context of cults is almost always controversial. If you're familiar with Bible stories, think of the stories about Jesus being accused of being possessed by a demon, of breaking up families, of teaching in secret. Or think of the later 2nd and 3rd and 4th century Greco-Roman critiques of Christianity that emphasize its abandonment of reason, its preying upon the gullible and vulnerable, it's alienating children from parents, and you hear echoes of the contemporary cult controversy. Cults and sects are by nature critical of the status quo, and that criticism provokes negative and defensive responses. The exchange of critiques sharpens the differences between inside and outside. I'd like to quote the eminent historian of religions, Kermit the Frog, at this point. Well known for saying it ain't easy being green, he can be transposed into suggesting that it ain't easy being different. It takes time, effort, and persistence to maintain differences, and one of the things that the longer run teaches us about sects and so-called cults is that the inner momentum of any new religion is towards either dissolution or accommodation. Logic. Cult beliefs and practices can certainly seem threatening and strange to outsiders. Heaven's Gate spaceship, early Mormon plural marriage, early Christian martyrdom, Buddhist asceticism, Dionysiac enthusiasm, and the ever-popular unificationist mass marriages. Outsiders rarely take the time to discuss and understand these individual beliefs and practices as part of a larger integral system. That is at least one of the tasks of the academic study of religion. Insiders also can insist on their differences to the detriment of communication with the outside. One only has to read the tragic colloquy between David Koresh and the FBI negotiators to learn that they're not talking about the same thing ever at all. The religious systems of cults usually proceed, however, from a few fundamental and often rather unremarkable observations. Matter is an impediment to spiritual fulfillment. Yes, say the people of Heaven's Gate. Yes, say the Buddhists. Yes, say ancient and modern Gnostics. Love for one's fellow humans should guide all behavior. Yes, says the Unification Church. Yes, says the New Testament, with almost a single voice. So one of the things that we need to think about in thinking about what I call new religious movements or alternative religions is the most gracious and challenging statement I've ever encountered about a new religion. It came from the Reverend John Moore, who lost 2 daughters and a grandson at Jonestown. It's very simple. Jonestown people were human beings. If he can say that, I suggest we might try saying that, at least for a time. So what, in conclusion? I think it's important to separate personal, organizational, societal, and governmental responses to new religions and to clarify the constraints and possibilities in each case. New religions intentionally challenge people's values. Responding to that challenge could be healthy on both sides. Just as new religions have changed people's minds, so have people changed new religions. Opponents of new religions and critics of them are free to exercise their opinions so long as they remain in the realm of persuasion. I have many critical things myself to say about many different new religions. Those who would represent society, politicians, or shape its opinions, news media, academics, social workers, have an obligation to get the story straight and to consider all the options. I think here of the Waco Tribune-Herald's coverage of Mount Carmel, where they quoted people saying that they enjoyed their lives, that they found deep fulfillment within Mount Carmel, and then simply ignored that. The government response, I'd suggest, needs to be appropriate and proportionate. I have no doubt that David Koresh might well have taken a fall for child abuse. I don't think the appropriate and proportionate response for child abuse is 80 people armed to the teeth in a cattle trailer. There are good examples of the government being sensitive to the religious dimensions of things. The standoff with the Montana Freemen that ended relatively peacefully. There are also bad examples. For me, every attempt ever made to write a law in this country that distinguishes between acceptable and unacceptable religions, and certainly the tragedy of Waco. So I'd suggest we avoid the siren call of unthinking prejudice, consider whether it's possible to learn from principled dissent, and ponder the response of one Rabbi Gamaliel in the New Testament in responding to another new religion. The Jewish authorities had enjoined the early Christian apostles not to preach in the name of Jesus. But the book of Acts says, Peter and the apostles answered, "We must obey God rather than men," something that would fit in any new religion. But Rabbi Gamaliel concluded his recommendation to his colleagues with this: "So in the present case, I tell you, keep away from these men and let them alone. For if this plan or this undertaking is of men, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. You might even be found opposing God. There's an inexorable religious logic in these groups, say what you might about it. We ignore it, however, at our peril and peril for our society.
Panelists an opportunity, if they wish to respond to each other, they've heard, and see if they have some comment they'd like to make about what their colleagues had to say here. I don't know, Peter, or you, Cynthia, want to go first? Ladies first.
I've got just 3 brief points. First of all, I'm not aware of any cult awareness organization that I've worked with or been affiliated with that had as its goal to stop cults. I don't think you can have a way to stop cults without harming legitimate religions. I think what the goals of the organizations that I worked with and were aware of, it was to educate people about how cult recruiting works so that they could make a more informed decision, just as you would teach someone how to make decisions about who to go out with, as opposed to saying don't ever go out with somebody because you might get harmed. Secondly, I don't think that if you put the focus on beliefs and trying to determine what a cult is, a destructive cult, I don't think that it's going to make any impact in terms of minimizing the dangerous aspects of cults or cutting down on cult recruiting that's unethical. The problem is not what a group believes, it's how it deceives, what its practices are. And you can have 2 groups that believe exactly the same thing, and one can be a cult and one cannot, because one is using unethical and deceptive recruiting practices and influence techniques unethically, and the other is not. And the third thing is that I do agree with our other panelist, Dr. Gallagher, that I don't think the government can regulate what is legitimate religion and what is not, and that's why I think that the solution is ultimately awareness and education on the dynamics, the psychological dynamics, the influence techniques, and developing critical thinking.
I would like to agree also with what Cynthia said. I think education is paramount here. And a lot of people, for example, say that, well, under your definition, for example, the Marines are a type of a cult, or Alcoholics Anonymous are a cult because they take you away from your parents, for example. And the big difference there is that you know, in those groups, the initiate knows what they're doing. They know what they're getting into. And in a cult, and I agree, it's not a very good definition. We don't have a good definition for that. But I feel that when somebody enters a cult, they do not have informed consent. They do not know what they're getting into. And this is a crucial difference with any one of these groups or churches or new religions or reputable new religions. And I think we should never forget that when we are assessing what kind of an organization we're dealing with. Thanks.
If you want to respond, Mr. Gallagher.
I took my shot. I think that informed consent is often a retrospective judgment. I certainly think Riddick Bowe decided that he didn't know what he was getting into in joining the Marines, and he seemed to have had informed consent. He was well over the age of consent when he went in. It would be an interesting sidelight on that one to study the numerous dropouts from various boot camp experiences, either in the Marines or not. What I'm arguing for is an integral view of religious movements. I don't think that you can sever their beliefs from their actions. Certainly that's nothing I've ever encountered in any religion where they would separate belief and action. I also wonder, I guess, a little bit, just to sharpen my difference with Ms. Kisser, when you make an analogy between date rape, AIDS, and alcoholism and joining an alternative religion, whether you haven't stacked the deck ahead of time before you've investigated it.
Well, I think that in all those cases, the question is the person really critically thinking? And I don't see how it is a stacked deck. I think if it's a problem out there and you haven't educated young people as to how to assess the problem and evaluate it, they're going to fall into the pitfalls of it. I don't understand how it's stacking the deck at all. It's just saying there's a problem out there. I mean, we know there's a problem out there with cults. We've got dead bodies periodically. We've got, criminal cases. I don't understand. The comment doesn't make sense to me. But I do want to say one other thing real quickly. It's not about religion because not all cults are religious. There's a tax-exempt benefit of being religious, but there are cults that are political, there are cults that are economic, there are cults that are therapy group. So if we focus on religion, we're really missing what the problem is by narrowing it down to only groups that are called cults and only happen to be religious.
Well, all of you have alluded to the fact it's somewhat difficult, or we don't have a common definition of what cult is, and we might spend our time on that. But let me instead ask, maybe we can be more specific about what are the kinds of practices that you find and see that are so disturbing that we must warn people about, the specific kinds of things and ways in which the deception occurs or the practices. I mean, after all, most things like many of the ultimate dangerous activities are illegal in most states. It's the question of the practices that draw people in that you think get them there without their really making a free choice.
Well, I think, for example, one of the first things that I was subjected to when I tried to join a cult, it's a nomadic cult called the Brotherhood. It was temporarily based in Eugene, Oregon, and sort of the bad part of the University of Oregon section there, where there's tattoo parlors and sort of street people. They immediately gave me a sheet of paper after they decided I was worth spending time on. They gave me a sheet of paper in which they had taken out of context various quotes from the Bible, from the scriptures, where Jesus said, leave your parents and come with me, leave your families, leave your worldly goods and come with me. And in some instances, they totally misquoted the Bible, but this was given on a mimeographed sheet of paper, and for the first day and a half, they worked on me very assiduously to get me to separate myself from my family. Why did they do that? Because in the long run, when somebody's wavering and deciding whether or not to stay in a cult, the one force that can bring them back is usually their family, their parents, your mother, your father. That's why these cults, and so many of them do go for younger people, hit where it hurts the most. They go for the parents and they cut off the parents. And I've met dozens of people who were saying evil things about their parents. They're saying my parents are possessed by the devil, and this is what my cult leader, what my master or my leader says. And that's just one quick example of the beliefs that I saw.
Could you tell me a little bit more about the context that makes the multiple references to rejecting your biological family in the New Testament go away?
Are you asking
Mark
any of us?
3:31 to 35, with the conclusion, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking on those who sat about him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother."
I think it's unfair to take biblical citations out of context. I think
Well, I asked for the context.
Right,
What's the
but
context that
okay.
makes that go away?
I think the context is when you are dealing with a relationship with Christ, which is what that's talking about, then they are asking you to look at your relationship with your God or your Christ in a way that may require you to make some decisions that may put a precedent to your loyalty to your God over your loyalty to family. But that does not mean by any way, shape, or form that scripture or any of the others I've seen out of context by cults is preaching to turn your back on your family, or, one of the 10 Commandments, honor your father and your mother. So I think when you look at the Bible and you look at the way it works together, they are talking about a concept of your relationship with a God who, I might add, is not physically here on earth with us now. So I think that just, we could spend all night playing games by pulling scripture out and going back and forth. I would like to get more to the point that was asked, which is the influence techniques and how they work. I would say the best advice that I could give any of you, if I have this short time with you, to keep you from getting involved in a cult is, first of all, know what your vulnerabilities and interests are. Whatever it is, hiking, skiing, you've got a vulnerability, you've broken up with your husband, wife, whatever. Know your vulnerabilities and know that when somebody approaches you and starts talking to you about your special areas of interest or your vulnerabilities, that you could be pulled into a cult because you're putting your guard down. That doesn't mean it's a cult, it means you could be pulled in. Secondly, if you follow up with some kind of a contact with a group on your vulnerable area of interest or your personal need, then make sure that if you, after that initial contact, agree to go to a more isolated environment, or agree to go to a weekend retreat, or agree to sign up for a seminar, that you research that group and know about that group, because it is not Peter and I sitting here together or anybody else that is going to get you into a cult in a 5-minute conversation. It's going to be me drawing you into a more isolated environment where I then can use peer pressure, confession, sleep deprivation, or any number of other techniques that if you want to walk over to the psychology lab and put yourself in the hands of a professor or a student and say, I'm not vulnerable to mind control, I can't be influenced, then I would say, you know, give yourself to somebody for a week who knows about influence techniques, and you could be, your sexuality could be changed, or your politics, or a number of other things. So it's not the ideas that convert somebody, it is using the ideas to draw you into a more closed system where no one on the outside really sees what's going on.
Dr. Gallard, I didn't know if you had the question you raised, whether you had a comment that you wanted to make.
I don't think I got an answer, but we differ very strongly on how to interpret the evidence of the New Testament and what its possible relevance for this question might be.
Well, let me ask you, the part of the conversation so far has been toward just simply trying to make people aware of, so they can make a more informed choice of what they may or may not be getting into. But the question always arises, at what point does government intervention become an appropriate thing? And a couple of you somewhat addressed that, but I'm wondering if we might go at that a little bit more. Is this simply a matter of, shall we have a good free speech public debate about any kind of organization and the way they behave and recruit us or whatnot, because after all, television is loaded with efforts to recruit our money, recruit everything out of us. Or is there a point at which the government has a responsibility? Where does that, can you give us some guidance on that?
Well, I think when there's clear-cut evidence of criminality, or there is clear-cut evidence that one group is bending regulations in a way that the other groups do not, such as using money to buy guns when it's supposed to be tax exempt, or using massive amounts of money for frivolous litigation, filing 10 suits or 12 suits that all are exactly the same and that a higher court has already made a decision on. I think that you have to question, and I think that's a legitimate area to raise to government. But I think in terms of how can government interfere just because somebody's beliefs seem to suggest a certain course of action, I think it's got to be clear-cut evidence that would apply to a secular group as well. I think we probably all would agree on that.
Is that
Yeah, we should stick with that one.
Yeah, might make for a boring evening.
Well, is it possible to make that question harder by what about the children of parents who go into an organization and there are accusations that the children are being sexually abused? Is that just simply a normal legal question of trying to get the evidence, or is there any additional step that you see?
I think it is. I think just like you have this problem in Chicago, we got massive child abuse going on. And, they find out after the fact when the kids are brought into the emergency room. But unless a neighbor's reporting it or there's some facts, yeah, I think that's the problem. That's why I go back to awareness to begin with, so that you don't make the bad choices is really the only way to minimize the bad impact.
Yeah, unfortunately, our legal system is such that a group, which is a religious organization, gets more leeway to deal with the education of its children and the handling of its children than another group, which is not a religious organization. That's the way the system is set up.
Yeah, I'd say even to agree with you guys on this one, that the fact that the Texas Department of Protective Services, or whatever it was unable to pursue a child abuse complaint against Mount Carmel probably tells us more about bureaucratic organizations than it does about the Mount Carmel community.
Although I think what it does tell us is that the children, from everything that's come out now, for example, the children that were under the care of Dr. Bruce Perry and his team of mental health people, when they were brought out during the siege before there was the final fire, they did disclose abuse that was going on. The problem was the cult dynamics did not enable them to disclose the psychological influence, the fear, that kind of thing, to disclose, like when the social workers came, they were not allowed the kind of access that would have, private access to the children and that's not an uncommon problem, period. I mean, you know, somebody's beating their child. No, they don't want the child to speak to the social worker alone. So I think that the cult dynamics create a special problem, and if people who are dealing with group type of allegations don't understand the dynamics, they're not going to know how to ask the questions the right way. And if you don't know how to ask the questions the right way of somebody who's in a cult, you're not going to get the facts and the information that you need to bring it to fruition. In hindsight, I think, as you said, yeah, child abuse, yeah, it was wrong. But, you know, those children were in a cult and they were not going to disclose. They would probably rather die than tell on David Koresh.
Another thing that has not been dealt with by society at all is the abuse of women in cults. This is a huge problem, and some of the groups that I stayed with, I witnessed myself, the women were not allowed to talk at all unless they were spoken to. They performed, basically they were in slavery. They performed horrible tasks. They were not allowed to enter into any relationships unless the leader of that particular sour group approved of them. I saw this with my own sight, and this is something which is just coming out right now. A lot of these groups are vaguely Old Testament based. They're very fundamentalist, and they believe in a patriarchal system, and the master basically regulates everything. And usually women and children, as we said, get the short end of the stick.
Why don't we open it up? We have 2 microphones. If you'll please identify yourself. We'd like to have the first 4 questions come from students associated with the university. So let's let the first 4 be students, and if you will each identify yourselves and please ask a question.
Hi, my name is Eric Christopherson. I'm a junior at Harvard, and my question concerned sort of the organizational structure of these groups. There seems to be, on the surface, a lot of similarities, say, between these groups, whatever you want to call them, cults or new religions, and, say, terrorist groups and terrorist organizations, in the sense that that the leaders are very often, you know, highly educated or come from upper middle class strata often, and then are able to indoctrinate through different methods their followers. And I was wondering if that is also the case with cults or whatever, again, what you want to call them, or I'm just really interested because I don't really know how the organization works, where these leaders come from, where does these ideologies and these religions sort of stem from?
Well, I wouldn't have probably focused on it that way. I would say that the biggest identifier of a true destructive cult in terms of organizational is that there are no checks and balances the way you see in legitimate denominations or in legitimate organizations, so that when there is a grievance, the grievance usually goes right back to the person who's perpetrating there. And so it becomes a closed system, and then the person who brought the grievance ends up being fearful of punishment. And I think, though, that what you can see, and what I've observed over the years, is that with cult leaders, you generally see 3 characteristics. Number 1, they are very charismatic in some way or appealing. Number 2, they are unethical and are willing to cross moral boundaries that most people would not. And number 3, they're willing to use influence techniques in that unethical manner to affect you. And I think what you see is a certain type of behavior at the top, but then organizationally, I mean, I don't think that what you don't see is the checks and balances, the accountability, or the monitoring. Like legitimate churches have, you know, boards you can go to. There's grievance committees. You just don't see that, or if you do, it's a sham.
I'd suggest reframing the comparison. I think it's too gross with those constituents, cult on one side and terrorist group on the other, since both tend to be a little fuzzy. If you look at contemporary neo-paganism, it's amorphous. It does not tend to invest power or authority in individual leaders. It invested in the individual. If there is such a thing as the New Age movement, it tends to be, as a whole, similar to that, though in parts maybe more similar to leader-driven groups. So I think you have to sharpen the question about leadership, and then be informed about the nature of leadership, at least as articulated by famous propositions like Max Weber's, in which there's the argument that followers make the leader as much as vice versa, picked up by Peter Worsley, picked up by Kendall Burridge, and a number of other people.
But a cult can be a terrorist group. Ohm's a good example. It was a terrorist group, and it was a cult. So you can have the cult dynamics turn a group into a terrorist group because that's the direction the leader wants to take it in.
Yeah, I think it's actually a very good to juxtapose the two, because there was one group that I stayed with whose leading members had gravitated from one of the most famous militia groups and terrorist groups in the 1980s called the Posse Comitatus, which killed 2 federal agents in the early 80s. And they just disappeared, the leader was jailed, and all of a sudden they materialize in this religious group outside Abilene, Texas. And this is basically a terrorist group which is running a doomsday cult right now. The only other thing I'd like to add is that psychologists estimate that about 70 to 80% of cult leaders basically do not believe what they're preaching. This was certainly the case with Jim Jones, who knew from the age of 13 that he wanted to be a cult leader already. And I think it's not true with Marshall Applewhite, who's a rarity. He was basically a paranoid person, apparently. So, yes.
Hello, my name is Jeremy Dolbeck. I'm a first-year student here at the Kennedy School. And I wanted to ask you what each of you thought about the sort of the ethical dimensions of, for want of a better term, kidnapping of a consenting adult who joins a cult, and then their parents feel that they're in danger, and then they go in and take that person out. To me, it just seems very similar. If any of you, I don't know if you've ever been to a Southern Baptist old-fashioned kind of revival, those kind of mind control or influence techniques that you're talking about, I think are very similar with some mainstream religions. And with the issue of children, it seems like you could make some sort of similar case with the children of the Amish or a number of different groups. I don't know, but mainly, what do you think about the kidnapping or taking out of cults?
Well, okay, sure, I'll take a crack.
My first response was, you could probably guess by now. Go ahead.
I think basically most of I don't agree with the term kidnapping, although the courts have had a field day here, but I think basically most of the cases where people are forcibly removed from cults, and Cynthia's, the nation's leading expert on trying to help people exit these groups. Most of these cases involve the parents who want to get their kids out and present very good reasons for why that should be done. The parents are never prosecuted usually, as far as I know. It's always the person who arranges the deprogramming.
Did you?
I just don't think it's an ethical option for someone who is of legal majority age. I think that it is foolish to deny that people who take principled stances against the mainstream do not cause pain to others and do not suffer pain themselves as a result of the stance that they adopt. But whether I would want to countenance investing so much power in parents over adult children, I can't say yes at that point.
No, I would say it's a crime to kidnap. Don't do it, number one. And number two, that kidnapping is often mixed up with deprogramming. And deprogramming is a process. There's no statute on the books that says it's illegal to do deprogramming. Deprogramming is a counseling process whereby information is made available to someone and they're challenged to think. I've seen it done over the telephone. I've seen it done, people walking into an office and asking to sit down and have this counseling process. It becomes a crime if someone is kidnapped so that they can participate in a deprogramming process. So you've got to separate out the process of deprogramming from criminally bringing someone who's an adult. Obviously for minors, there's all kinds of reasons why parents can and do have their children talked to about any number of things, from drug use, alcoholism, on down.
Hi, I'm Claire Monteleone. I'm a senior at the college. My question is for Ms. Kisser. You mentioned that one of sort of the programming actions that a cult might do once the defenses of an inductee were down would be to change their sexuality. And I was wondering if you view someone coming out after being involved with a certain group of people as then characterizing that group as a cult, and also if you view someone coming out as not being themselves coming out and instead a reaction to a cult, if you can actually program someone's sexuality.
I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but what I'm saying is that while you are in a group, your political beliefs, your sexuality, your sense of relationship with your family, any of those things, in a sophisticated enough thought reform program where you are a captive either voluntarily through deception or involuntarily for a long enough period of time, can reshape that. However, in order for that to remain constant, that change, you must be continually exposed to the indoctrination procedures once you've had that initial conversion on a regular basis. And so once you are removed from that environment, either because you've left on your own and gradually over time the influence fades because you're not being subjected to this constant thought reform regime, or once you are removed because you're sent to jail or something and you're no longer a part of that program, then you tend to revert back to your normal personality and your normal sexuality and that type of thing. So that's why you see like the famous Cardinal Manzetti case, for example, where someone was in a communist prison and recanted his Christian beliefs, but then after he was removed from that indoctrination environment, he was able then to revert back to and freely embrace his own beliefs. So it's temporary, but to the degree that you're in the thought reform program.
Thanks.
My name is John Lester. I'm an undergraduate here at the university. I have a general question for the full panel. How do you feel that the media has dealt with a lot of the major events that's been associated with these groups recently?
Well, as a media member, I feel honored to defend my profession. We have to do a lot of it these days. I think the media is having a lot of trouble, first of all, with the definitions, as you've seen yourselves today, where there's no clear definition of a cult. And we see a large wavering between the media totally not paying attention to, as Jean correctly pointed out, the true beliefs, the religious aspects of these cults. Nobody particularly wrote about the fact that David Koresh really believed that and studied the Bible and knew it very well. So there's a very superficial understanding of these cults to blanket coverage and fear-mongering and sort of things that basically tell these cults that they're seeing their prophecies fulfilled. They're seeing their worst fears fulfilled because the media is fomenting this huge wave of fear and recrimination against cults. So I think particularly television doesn't know how to handle this. There's a good example that was told to me a few days ago. There was one of the national networks wanted to infiltrate a cult, and it sent one of its best reporters into a major cult, and they had a hidden camera like on a button, and they wanted to sort of document the process of indoctrination. And after two weeks, the young man didn't go back, and he'd been indoctrinated into the cult, and they had to pay for his deprogramming afterwards. So that was a big failure.
Where'd he go? Oh, there he is. One interesting thing in my recent experience of doing newspaper interviews was the people who tend to write about this subject are starting, I think, to get fairly savvy, to know that there's a couple different points of view, as were evidenced this evening, and to be able to negotiate their way through that. But I heard several times, they want me to ask you this. So in my experience, it hasn't percolated all the way up to editorial decision makers. They want me to give them a list of what will tell people what's a cult and what isn't. I say, well, I don't want to give you that. I said, but they want me to get that. So I said, you'll have to ask somebody else.
Well, I would say in response to your question that, first of all, one of the things, and I touched on this in my opening remarks, it is that there's a huge amount of jockeying and propaganda going on the part of some of these groups, and some of it does affect how media cover stories. I had one major electronic media tell me, well, Cynthia, we were told that if we mention the Church of Scientology and Jonestown in the same piece, we're going to get sued by the Church of Scientology. They didn't do that. They didn't mention those two words. I have seen people say, well, we can't do a story on this even though we have information because we're going to get sued. I think the other thing, so I think the cults are influencing to some degree the information control, the information that gets out there by virtue of either threat or very slick propaganda. I mean, I've read stuff about myself that if I didn't know who I was, I might think that I was some kind of a criminal and a sex pervert, you know, and it's that well put together. Second thing is that I will just give you 2 questions and let you figure out which one is the responsible media question in terms of handling a cult story and which is the irresponsible. So, Cynthia, can you name the next group where there's going to be a suicide? Or, Cynthia, how can we understand how this suicide occurred and what kind of things can be done to help prevent this kind of tragedy in the future? And right there, those 2 different approaches, one scare tactics, one breeds this hysteria that we end up getting blamed for. You know, and oftentimes, even when we say something that tries to minimize that hysteria-mongering question, we still get dragged into it. And I mean, I've been told that I specifically said that Jesus Christ was a cult leader because the context in which my quote came out, you know, if Jesus Christ were alive today, we'd think he was a cult leader. That's the quote that's come back at me. And yet that wasn't the point I was trying to make at all. So I think the sophistication of the reporter has a lot to do with it.
That's me. Yes.
My name is Leo Carrillo.
No, I said that there's a cult.
I'm a student at the Kennedy School. My question is for Dr. Gallagher, and I was curious to know if you agreed with your colleagues on the panel that groups can use mind control towards destructive ends as they have described suicide, other types of things. I have a personal experience where a very close friend of mine was involved with a person who professed to be a shaman, and within a month he was dead from suicide.
Not knowing anything about that case, I can't respond to that. I think that one thing that's important to know is that thought reform, brainwashing, programming, deprogramming, exit counseling, all have a lot of the metaphorical about them, and that they give us frames for understanding fairly complex human interaction, and that when we let the frames dictate the conclusions before we examine the cases in detail, we make a mistake.
Yeah.
There are multiple other frames available. Possession, for example, demonic possession, as I referred to from the New Testament, is another one.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Steve Hassan of Somerville. For the record, I believe in God. I pray, I meditate. I also am a former insider of Sun Myung Moon's unification organization. I was recruited at Queens College after a breakup with a girlfriend. I said, "Are you part of some religious group?" They said, "No, not at all." And so began the deception that led me to drop out of college, quit my job, donate my bank account. And 2.5 years I spent deceptively recruiting people and indoctrinating people to believe that Moon was a messiah. This is the same fellow who is convicted, is a convicted felon, who put $1 billion into the Washington Times newspaper. This is the same man who said, when we, to me and other leaders at the time in 1974, when we take power in America, we will amend the Constitution and make it a capital offense for people to have sex with people other than those assigned to them by the church. And he went on to explain how we'd be doing people a favor by taking their physical bodies away from them so they wouldn't sin, and we could save them later in the spirit world. This is the same guy who has George Bush, Gerald Ford, and other celebrities and politicians coming to $1 million, $2 million conferences. This is the same man who wants to abolish all religions other than his, all languages other than Korean. And we're talking at the Institute of Politics, and they have funded think tanks for terrorism. They have infiltrated all levels of our society. And I say to you, this is a bigger issue. It's already gotten into mainstream institutions affecting all of our society. I can tell you that mind control is real, hypnosis is real, behavior modification is real. Dr. Phil Zimbardo of Stanford, one of the preeminent social psychologists of our time, has been teaching a course at Stanford called the Psychology of Mind Control for over 10 years. The processes are known to social psychologists of how to take a person from step A and bring them to step Z. And I think any kind of discussion of trying to cloud over the issue in the area of beliefs and missing, as Cynthia Kisser so eloquently points out, the behaviors and the fraudulent behaviors. And before I finish, I just want to say I definitely
Please do.
think...
We want to make sure everybody else gets in.
Okay, then I'll stop.
Actually, to ask a question, my name is Massey, and I'm an undergraduate here at the college. And something that particularly interested me about the whole phenomenon of cults is that many people allege that the leaders of these organizations or the people that are the rulers of these organizations are in it for some sort of economic profit. But the two aspects that I can't reconcile are, if they are, what are the forces that drive people to commit suicide? And is suicide something common? Is it the common culmination of a lot of these cults?
Well, I'd say that they are in it for power. They have an inordinate lust for power. It doesn't have to be economic power. It can be physical power. It can be sexual power. It can be, but it's power. And that's where you get into, lots of people have a lust for power. That's what drives politics. That's what drives business. But where you have that willingness to cross unethical boundaries, which you also see in politics and business, but then you see this use of the mind control techniques, that's where you get the cult part. I think as far as the suicide, what happens sometimes, and I think Koresh's group was a good example, is that it became trapped, and at a certain point, you know, it got to a point where the logical extension, given the circumstances, i.e. the confrontation, the armed confrontation, was, you know, an execution of a belief system. And so if these groups become, once they begin to spiral downward, that's when I think you have the danger of the suicide or the reverse. An outward violence, which is like Om Shinrikyo, terrorism towards the general public. So as it becomes stranger and stranger, they become more separate and more separate, and they have more and more to hide, and they're more and more afraid. The protective services is coming to the door, law enforcement is checking on them, and it creates a paranoia. And as we know from mental health illness, you know, somebody who's paranoid enough may commit violent acts that they would not normally do if they had not reached that heightened state, which, you know, so it becomes a downward spiral sometimes, if there's no interference or no new information coming in or no new change in leadership.
I hold the issue of suicide to be moot, at least in the case of the Mount Carmel community. I don't deny Heaven's Gate or Jonestown, but I'm curious as to the statistical persuasiveness of 2 out of what we've heard were 3,000 to 5,000 groups. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be aware that that could be a possibility. It does suggest right now that it's not an inevitability, and it also suggests, I guess I'm the academic on the panel, that we need to know our history. We need to look very carefully at the history of the concept of suicide and the related concept of martyrdom in the West since, at least the post-exilic era in ancient Israel.
I think I'd like to say also that the fear is one of the best uniting elements of a cult, and all cult leaders gather their flocks by ratcheting up the tension, by getting the fear involved, and getting people to commit more money, to become more part of the group, and Koresh used this. I think it's no coincidence that Marshall Applewhite bought weapons because he wanted to provoke ascending to the next level. He wanted to provoke an apocalypse, and I found this in the groups that I visited, and I think it's no coincidence that with the approach of the millennium, a lot of the groups are using the tension to commit suicide, or to basically to approach the point where they have to leave this world. And commenting on the gentleman who used to be with the Unification Church, I thought he made a good point, because indeed many cults are entering politics. One of the fastest growing cults in the world today is called Qinghai. It's based in Taiwan, run by a Vietnamese woman. And they decided they wanted to influence American policy towards Asia, China specifically. So they converted a close friend of President Clinton's, and the leader, this lady, she gathered $460,000 and that money was given to Clinton's Defense Fund back in December. I think many of you probably remember that. I infiltrated that group, and it's a pretty scary organization, too.
But I don't think we should, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to say one other suggestion, especially in this venue, that I think for people interested in politics, the more interesting question might be, what about murder? To look at the intersection of what I still persist in calling religious convictions and radical political action, including terrorism and other forms of violence, is a very interesting realm of activity now with the militia movement and related things, and one that hasn't been looked at very carefully in its religious dimensions. So that's another way to go with that question.
I also think, however, we're neglecting a huge area with cults by focusing on the ones that become paranoid and perhaps violent prone. That is, cults that have a cadre or inner core that are loyal, but that basically exist as an economic entity to make a lot of money for the group, and so they offer courses and training and that, and their goal may not to be to recruit everybody that takes the course to become a dyed-in-the-wool member, but to get the $200 or $500 per head out of them for the seminar or whatever, and then move on to the next one. So I think commercial cults, some of which are religious and some of which are not, that offer training and programs, also need to be looked at, because they'll go on forever. As long as they're undetected and there's not, people aren't aware of them, they'll just keep recruiting because they're bringing in the money, and that's what it's about for them. That lust for power is a money lust for power, not a lust for power to be able to say when you can die and when you can live.
I think we're only going to have time for about one more question here. We're ready to run over. Go ahead. Yes, sir.
My name is Eric Walker, and I have a question concerning a statement made a little earlier. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Concerning, I believe it was your statement, Mr. Gallagher, when you said that when discerning a group, I'm sorry, a religious group that is seeking to take you into its fold, whether through coercive methods or otherwise, you suggested that the best thing to do is to examine the context of the materials they're presenting to you and see, excuse me, and have a chance to examine the beliefs or the statements or the written documents of this organization as a way to determine whether or not this organization is in fact a cult or a legitimate group or otherwise. However, it does seem that several of these groups of this sort have made very strong efforts to hide the actual truth of their doctrines from their believers, such that people who are, say, taken in off the street are not actually told what they're going to learn when they move higher up through the levels of this organization. There are many examples of this. I think one of the most well-known examples has occurred on the internet over the last couple of years, as the Church of Scientology has filed lawsuits against several internet providers, has convinced federal marshals to raid the homes of at least 3 of their critics, have tried to remove the internet news group Alt Religion Scientology, have filed lawsuits against the Washington Post and many other excuse me, internet companies as well. I won't get into that. Suffice to say that the reason why they're doing this, they claim the people on the internet are engaging in what they call copyright violations, whereas on the other hand, the people on the internet claim that they are in fact exposing the truth about this organization, a truth that would not be revealed if a person were to merely read the lessons or brochures that were given to them by Scientology. And using this example, I was wondering if you'd wanted to comment on groups that are apparently making efforts to hide the truth from their members or from the media in general.
I think, okay. There's a lot in your question. First of all, I don't think what I got attributed to me I said. I'm not interested in providing a list to would-be converts either. I think that one thing I'd like to at least open to question is the image of a convert as a rational consumer. This notion that people convert to whatever the heck you want to call them, cults or whatever, as an entirely rational process of truth-seeking. I'm not sure that that does justice to the data that I'm familiar with, from as early as Augustine's Confessions up to many autobiographical accounts, including the one that Mr. Hassan gave. Your own. That was the one you gave, right? Okay. That they involve many more aspects of a human person than the rational decision-making abilities. So I wouldn't at all counsel what you attributed to me, and I would even call into question that image of the convert.
Well, I'll certainly apologize if I was referring to you as opposed to the
But you're saying
original context
that
of the statement.
people join any kind of religious group may not be doing
For
it
multiple
rational
reasons,
consumer.
emotional reasons, passionate reasons.
So it's hard to sort out, is
So
what you're saying.
this notion that a potential convert sits there with, okay, I've got the divine principle here, I've got Dianetics here, I got a Bible here, I got the Quran over there, which one's best?
Well,
Doesn't
actually,
seem to work.
Actually, my question was,
But he's asking about specifically if they
yes,
deceive you as to
specifically
what,
if you're
what
looking,
they believe.
say, at the teaching of this organization, and they say to you, oh, this is what we teach. But then, say, perhaps a year later, after you've gone through their processing or so forth, they then come to you and say, that wasn't it at all. This is the real truth.
Yeah, and I would say that the deception in and of itself in terms of what you believe wouldn't necessarily make a group a destructive cult. However, any group that is not a destructive cult should be willing to be very upfront about what they believe, and if you've been in the group for 10 years, that same set of beliefs should be the set of beliefs you were confronted with on day one, although it might not have been in as much detail. And I think that's really, I think, a key thing that you're bringing out that is important. Disclosure of what you believe is what ethical religions, or what you'll be expected to believe is what ethical religions do in fact engage in.
Well, with that, ladies and gentlemen, we've occupied more than our normally allotted time to this. I want to thank very much our three panelists for being with us and coming here today and speaking to us. And so let's give them a round of applause.